Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. It looks like just about everybody's come on that's going to come on. Wanted to share some information with you first before we get started on our program. So my name is Chris Johnston. I'm a board member for the Friends of Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge. And just a reminder, we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization, which was established in 1997 to support Ohio's only national wildlife refuge complex with youth development, public use projects, and most recently, land acquisition and restoration. We're super excited about that. We are located along the southern shore of Lake Erie, right near Oak Harbor, in some of the most critical wetland habitats in the world. If you're interested in learning more about us and what we do, I will add a link to the chat in just a brief moment. This link will point you in the right direction to become a member, make a tax-deductible donation, to support our work, or even to shop our online nature store, which is an amazing place. Today, I am joined by Brendan Shirkey, who is a research biologist at Winous Point Marsh Conservancy. He holds a master's degree in wildlife management and has worked on multiple avian research and monitoring projects with many partners. He has graciously joined us today to share his program, Winous Point Rail Research, with us. At this point, I will go ahead and let Brandon take it away.
Thanks, Chris, for the introduction. As far as questions go, there should be plenty of time at the end if folks want to raise their hand. Also, feel free to type questions in the chat as we go along, and I can try and answer stuff at the end. As Chris mentioned, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Brendan Shirkey. I'm the research biologist at the Winous Point Marsh Conservancy. So we're also a 501c3. We're located super close to the refuge, just up the road, a little bit to the east, closer to Port Clinton. But we work closely with the refuge on a number of projects, and then we also facilitate just a lot of research in general throughout the Midwest with various universities. So the talk that I'm going to focus on is, as you can see here, it's going to talk about king rails, Virginia rails, and soras in Lake Erie's coastal wetlands. So a lot of the talk will focus on birds that we've captured and studied here at Winous, but we've also captured birds at the refuge, at Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge, and then we've had birds that are marked with transmitters that show up there as well. So without further ado, I'll jump right in here. Whoops, too far. Too fast with the buttons there. So this will kind of serve as an outline. I really want to focus on the people first. So what I'm going to do for the majority of this talk is kind of hit the highlights from 4 recent graduate students who've worked at Winous Point. So we've kind of been their field housing and their home base as they've done their research here. So just in the last 5 years, we've had 4 kids work with all 3 of these rail species that I'm going to get into. So first, I'll talk about Jim Hansen's work. So Jim was a master's student at Ohio State University, I think starting in 2017. He's moved on, he's graduated. He actually works for Idaho Fish and Game now. And then Nicole Hanks, who is also a master's student at Ohio State, and she just recently took a job with the Fish and Wildlife Service down around Chesapeake Bay, down in Maryland. And then I'll switch over to Michelle Keene, who worked with Central Michigan University. And she's now with the Fish and Wildlife Service out in California. Sorry, there's things popping up on my screen here. And then finally, Dustin Brewer, who's a PhD student at Central Michigan as well. So, you know, the kids, they get all the credit for what I'm going to talk about here. They've done some really great work, and we've learned just a ton. I think we've opened as many cans of worms as questions that we've answered. So we've got a lot of stuff still to figure out. But they've done some great work. So before I get into the specific projects, I just want to give a little bit of context on the bird species that we're talking about if there's some folks in the room who are less familiar with rails. So the common rails in Ohio are king rails, Virginia rails, and sora are probably the most common. So I'll start off with king rails. So I just talked about how these birds are relatively common, but king rails are actually state endangered in Ohio. So really rare. They have a really interesting population dynamic in that there's a resident Gulf Coast population that does really well. There's lots and lots of king rails down around the Gulf Coast, the Florida Panhandle, Louisiana, Texas. They're actually a game bird, so they can be hunted down there. They're the largest of the rail species commonly found in Ohio, so about 300 grams, so kind of like a small chicken. They surprise you when you see them, how big they really are. Primary prey would include crayfish and other small aquatic invertebrates for the most part. It's hard to see in this picture, but they've got kind of a long pointy bill for probing around in the mud, looking for critters to eat. And just to kind of illustrate, how rare these birds are, we've participated. There's a large coordinated survey effort for rails, which I'll talk about in a couple of slides. But we've participated in that for quite a while here at Winous Point. And over the course of 7 years, we've only had one detection ever of a king rail. And you're talking over 200 survey points. So either really, really rare, or maybe we're not so good at detecting them either. So Virginia rails, this is a picture there in the top left of a Virginia with a radio transmitter on it. That's what that antenna is. So they're quite a bit smaller than the king rails. You can see really similar sort of look to them. But they're only, a big Virginia is 100 to 125 grams, so about a third of the size of the king rails, much smaller. Their bodies are laterally compressed, just like all the rails, hence the phrase skinny as a rail. And they actually have special feathers on their foreheads that withstand wear so that they're not rubbing their heads raw as they work their way through the marsh vegetation. So really cool birds. If you look the bottom left there, I think assume the bottom left of your screen. So that kind of shows a range map for these birds. You can see we're right on the southern edge of what's thought to be the breeding range. So we probably do have some breeding Virginia rails here in Ohio, but much more common as a spring and fall migrant. I'll get into more details with the graduate student projects for some of that. So sora, so these are the smallest of the rail species that you'd commonly find in Ohio, so usually less than 100 grams. You can see their bill morphology is a little different. They've got a little bit shorter, stubbier beak, and they're a little bit more seed eaters than what the king rails and Virginia rails are, although they will still eat aquatic invertebrates. And you can see the range map there, a lot of overlap with Virginia rails, very similar. So Ohio is right at the southern extent of the breeding range, but really common as a spring and fall migrant. So I've heard Virginia rails in the marsh just in the last couple of days at Winous. I haven't heard of sora yet, but they'll be here very soon. So kind of late April, and they have that really distinctive whinny call. So conservation. When we talk about conservation for these species, it gets really tricky right off the bat. Because how in the world do you monitor these populations? So some of you may be, really avid birders, or maybe you're just familiar with wetlands in general. Rails are really, really hard to see just based on their behavior and where they hang out. If you imagine you're in this kayak paddling through the marsh, these rails are running around in the cattail off to the left or the right. And your chance of seeing them is virtually nil. Like, you just don't run into these birds very often out in the open. So that begs the question of, how do we even know how many exist out in our wetlands? And it's really hard, if we want to look at the impacts of our management actions on these birds, well, you have to have some sort of response variable, right? You have to have some feel for how many birds out there, and did they actually respond to the management actions that we undertook? Or in terms of population trends, how many are they in population decline? I just talked about king rails and how they're fairly rare in this part of the Midwest, but we don't have a good feel for how many were here historically, just because these birds are so hard to monitor. And if you compare that to take another wetland dependent bird, for example, like ducks, they tend to sit in the wide open. There's aerial surveys that go back to the 1950s for waterfowl, where they have really good data on long-term trends for these species. There's good data on how they respond to different management actions, because they're really easy to count. For an example, my master's work was flying aerial surveys out over Lake St. Clair and Lake Erie counting diving ducks. So wide open lake with huge flocks of birds, right? Really easy to see. Whereas rails, you do not have that luxury when you're trying to estimate how many birds are actually out on the landscape and out in the wetlands. So how in the world do we tackle this problem? So beginning in the late 2000s, they developed what's called the Standardized Secretive Marshburg protocol. It was developed by a guy named Courtney Conway, I believe he's out in Idaho now. But really the goal was to develop a regional coordinated survey effort for this suite of birds that is just not well monitored with any other survey that's out there. Because there's a variety of bird surveys that are used by folks to estimate how many birds are out on the landscape, but none of them do a good job of targeting what are called these marsh birds. So of course, the 3 rail species that I talked about are part of this suite of birds, but also include like American bittern, least bittern, piebald grebes, common gallinals. Those would be other species that you would pick up on these secretive marsh bird surveys, at least here in Ohio. So it's an awesome coordinated survey effort. You know, there's multiple states in the Midwest who participate. Each state has survey routes, and each one of those routes has approximately 10 survey points. And how these surveys work is you revisit each of these points 3 times over the course of what's thought to be the breeding season. So in Ohio, we have a survey visit in mid-May, late May, and then early June. And while you're at your survey point, each one of these surveys is basically 10 minutes. You have a 5-minute passive listening and observing period. And then you have a 5-minute period where you have calls where you're trying to get rails or other secretive marsh birds to actually call back to you to get detections. So the vast majority of your detections are actually auditory. You're hearing birds, you're not actually seeing anything. You know, once in a while you have an observation of a bird that you physically see, but it's pretty rare. And the overall objective here is to estimate breeding populations of secretive marsh birds. They're not effectively monitored any other way. So let me back up here before I jump into the next slide. So this survey technique is really new, and then there's a lot of questions. There's, for those of you who, I'm not sure the audience in the room, but if there's folks who are really statistically minded or who deal with monitoring abundance and populations of wild animals, a lot of times there's a lot of assumptions that go into this process of estimating abundance with how you're out there collecting your data. So that's really what some of these graduate students got into. And the first one, Jim Hansen, that I'll jump into, that was a big part of his work, was basically evaluating some of the assumptions that go into this protocol for trying to estimate abundance of breeding marsh birds, secretive marsh birds. So I've got a picture of Jim up there in the top left. That'll kind of help you keep track of where I am in the presentation as I move through each one of these students' projects. But really one of the big objectives for Jim was testing assumptions for secretive marsh bird surveys. So the 2 big ones were population closure and then this detection probability at survey points. So I'll walk you through both of those. So for those of you that are statistics folks, population closure is really important to actually estimating abundance for these birds. So what you're assuming is over your survey period, you don't have birds moving in or out of your study area, because that really messes up your abundance estimate. So that's something we wanted to test, is how closed is this population of what we assume to be breeding marsh birds. And then as far as the detection probability, I'll get into that on later slides, but there's this methodology that's been developed that's called distance sampling that also allows you to estimate abundance. But there's some really key assumptions, but we'll talk about that in a couple of slides here. So how do you go about testing the assumptions of the survey protocol? So really the big thing was getting radio transmitters out onto Virginia rails and soras. That allowed us to do the work that we needed to do to estimate some of these things. So over the course of 3 years, the graduate students on this project, you know, they put 370 transmitters. So we caught tons and tons of Virginia rails and soras in the spring. There are a lot of these birds out in the marshes. And then they track these birds daily from the date of capture until the signal was lost. So just some of the pictures, you can see a sora and a Virginia rail, each with a transmitter. And then you can see that little tiny radio transmitter. That transmitter only weighs about 2.5 grams. So it doesn't affect the birds. It kind of sits like a rock climbing harness. So it's made of stretch magic cord that goes up over the bird's hips. And then there's little crimp tubes that are made for jewelry. So the cord is what little kids make jewelry or bracelets out of. So it's really fine material, real stretchy, but it just sits like a rock climbing harness, and then you secure it onto the bird. And then the range is pretty limited. So you have to be within a couple hundred meters in order to pick up the radio signal from the pulses that these transmitters are emitting. And then it's kind of hard to see, but the big picture on this screen is of one of the walk-in traps, which is how we catch the birds. So it's just a confusion trap. The birds walk in and then they can't figure out how to walk out, and we're catching them using audio lures, so using calls to attract them. So that was kind of the basis for the data set. So the quick and dirty of population closure here. So 370 marked birds over 3 years. 32% of the signals were lost within 1 to 2 days. And if you can see the graphs here on the right, I'll walk you through here. So we have each of the 3 survey periods. So survey window 1, 2, and 3. So these are the windows in Ohio when you would go out and do your surveys. And what that's depicting is birds that were marked either during that window or before, and the percentage of them that were still there at the end of the survey window versus the percentage of them that left. So what you can see, if you look at the last graph, over the course of that entire survey period, from a statistical standpoint, what you want to see is a bar that's got a bunch of gray in it, right? Where a bunch of these birds are still present at the end of your survey period. Well, for Virginia rails, you're talking 80 to 90% of the marked birds are gone by the end of the survey window. And for soras, every single bird that was marked left. So these birds are not, I'll get into this more later, but these birds are not sticking around in the way that we thought they were. And that was, originally a big part of Jim's work was going to be looking at breeding productivity for these birds, like nest success, chick survival. We thought we were going to find a bunch of nests and follow these birds around. Well, it turns out, at least in the big coastal wetlands in Northwest Ohio, these birds are not sticking around and breeding like we thought they were going to be. And there's some potential explanations for that. So interesting stuff. So this is the switching gears a little bit and talking about the correction factor data. So this is evaluating a different assumption that goes along with the standardized secretive marshbird surveys, but the same idea. It's taking the raw data that you would collect and trying to generate an abundance estimate. And the idea here is using what's called distance sampling methodology. So just to give you a real quick overview of distance sampling, if you imagine you're driving down the road in your car and you're counting deer, every single deer that is on the road you're going to see, right? You're not going to miss that deer if it's standing on the road. And you're going to see a lot of the deer that are right next to the road. But as you get further and further away from that road, your detection probability is dropping off, right? And all distance sampling does is fit a function to what that relationship is, to allow you to estimate how is your detection probability dropping off with distance. The fundamental assumption of distance sampling is that your detection probability right on the road or right at your survey point is 1. You have to be detecting every bird that's right at your survey point, because that basically sets the height of your function. That's what the rest of the model is built off of. Well, as you can imagine with these birds, if they're not calling back, your detection probability, even right at the survey point, is probably not 1. The bottom right picture, that's our research tech, Jess Schmidt. Now, Jess is only 5'3", but that cattail is still really tall that's around her, right? It's 7 or 8 feet tall. And if there's a Virginia rail running around at her feet, but not making any noise, she is not going to pick that bird up. So we have really big issues with this detection probability of 1 at the survey point. So the goal, what we called these were correction factor surveys. So we would go out, we would track radio marked individuals. We would get reasonably close, within 30 meters. We were trying to get close enough that we know if the bird calls, we can hear it. It's not the observer's inability to pick it up. If we're not picking it up, it's because the bird didn't respond to the survey, right? So track these birds through the marsh, do a standardized secretive marshbird survey. So stand there for 10 minutes and then record whether we're actually getting a detection on that bird or not. And then track the response rate. So it's allowing us to correct for potential violation of this first assumption of distance of detection probability being 1. So that's what this figure depicts here on this slide, is kind of what I just walked you through, right? So that's why this assumption is so important, because it sets the height for that function. So the red line would be, that's how your detection probability is dropping off with distance, right? So if you think of driving down the road in deer, once you get 1,000 meters from the road, you're not seeing any of the deer, right? But right at the line, you see every single one. But you can see you have to make an adjustment if you're not actually at 1. And that's exactly what we found for the rails. So for Virginia rails, we're only picking up birds about 47% of the time on these correction factor surveys. And for sora, it's even less, only 30% of the time. We did in excess of 200 of these correction factor surveys. So going out and following these individual birds and doing a survey. So what that tells you right off the bat is if you tried to take your raw data and generate abundance estimates, you're biased way low. You're only half the population or less is actually available to be detected at any given time. So that's really important to know for trying to improve the surveys and develop abundance estimates. The silver lining here, though, because we looked at, are there a lot of other factors that are potentially influencing vocalization rates, right? Because if vocalization rates are changing with, say, weather or date or from one year to the next, then the number of detections you get isn't even indicative of how many birds are out there. So your raw data really isn't telling you anything in terms of trends. But what we found is there's not a lot influencing vocalization rates. So these birds, regardless of whether it's April or July, they're calling at the same rate. From one year to the next, they call at the same rate. With different weather conditions, they're really not changing their behavior in terms of response. So that's a really good thing from the standpoint that at least the data we're collecting is really good trend data. We can't call it abundance data, but if you get more detections, there's more rails in the marsh, that's an important first step to understand. So I'll switch gears here a little bit. This is the second graduate student on the project. So this is Nicole Hinkst, who is also through Ohio State University. And her focus was really on movement patterns and then fine scale habitat selection of these birds. So generally we know rails like wetlands, they like marshes, they like emergent vegetation that they can hide in, but what specific characteristics are they really keying in on or things that are key to these birds being successful in our marshes? So those are the two big objectives there. This slide should look super familiar because she used the same data set that Jim did. So they worked together, marking 370 some birds, and Jim essentially tackled one aspect of the project, and then Nicole tackled this other aspect. So if we get into the habitat assessment, just the real quick and dirty of how this was done is they would go out and get rail locations, just like we were for the correction factors. So you can see in the blue here, the blue pins there would be an example of a rail location. And they would do a bunch of habitat measurements at that exact location where you had a radio marked bird. And then you take a random bearing and walk 25 meters away and do the same habitat assessment at a random location that's paired with that rail location. So you're trying to see, are there differences between right where this rail was using and then a short distance away to get a feel for micro habitat selection. Are there certain water depths or certain vegetative species or certain characteristics of the vegetation that are really important to these rails being successful? So that's our research tech again, just there. That is about as easy as one of these surveys would get as far as traversing through our marshes. Normally this is miserable, hard labor trucking through the wetlands in some of these areas where these rails live and doing these habitat assessments. So, they spent a ton of time out there collecting this data. So there's a lot going on here, but really the ultimate finding here is pretty simple. So just as an example, these are graphs that Nicole put together of water depth, and then percent visual obstruction and percent cover of water to see how were those influencing rails using the wetlands. Basically what she found is she could not detect any significant differences between the rail locations and the paired random locations, right? And there's a lot of potential explanations for this. It could be maybe 25 meters wasn't far enough to pick up on what rails are actually selecting for, right? Because they're certainly capable of moving 25 meters. So maybe that's well within the habitat they were using, and we just didn't have enough distance between those points to pick up on what we were trying to pick up on. Or maybe in reality, rails don't really select for much. Maybe all that's important, or maybe because of the characteristics of our wetlands, they're using the only available habitat that they can. So they can't select for anything. They're just crammed into the spaces that allow them to be successful. Or a third possibility is maybe we just really stink at measuring variables that are actually important to rails, right? It's really hard for us, put yourself in the shoes of a bird that's 3 or 4 inches tall and how they perceive the landscape and what characteristics of the landscape are actually important to them. We're trying to do that, but we're still looking at things from a human perspective. So maybe we just didn't measure the sorts of things that we needed to understand what is important to rails. So the second aspect of Nicole's project, and this is, I'll take my time on this slide. This is really cool stuff to me and really new stuff that we learned about rails. And this was not a direction the project was intended to go, but I talked about, with Jim's work, how we had all these birds leave, right? And we were really surprised. We thought we were going to have a bunch of breeding rails, and we didn't. So the logical question is, well, where are these birds going? So unfortunately, they're too small to carry a GPS transmitter, which would be how you typically answer some of these large-scale movement questions. But they could carry what's called a nanotag transmitter. So how these nanotags work, the bottom left is a picture of a Modus tower. So these towers are actually located, they're actually all over the world. This is a screenshot here with all the yellow dots. Each one of those yellow dots is a Modus tower location, throughout the United States and Canada, and you can see they go down into Central America. So if a bird equipped with one of these nanotag transmitters flies close enough to a tower, it pings off one of these towers. So you can actually get some large-scale movement data from some really teeny transmitter tags. Because typical radio transmitters, like I mentioned before, their range is really limited. So, a bird could only move a mile, but you might never detect that bird again. Or maybe it picked up and migrated into northern Ontario. You just don't know. But the Modus towers allowed us to kind of answer this. So this figure here that Nicole put together on the right, it's just really interesting stuff. So the pre-nesting stage, think of as spring migration. So the triangles, those show hits from Modus towers during spring migration. So you can see if you go north of Lake Erie, there's a bunch of triangles going up into into central Ontario, right? So these are birds that blew right through Winous and they kept right on going, breeding way north of Ohio. And then the squares shows birds that we're picking up in the middle of the summer. So we're assuming they're nesting at that point. So you can see there's squares in northern Michigan, there's a bunch in Ontario, there's one way over in western New York. And then it's kind of hard to see, but there's a few locally in northwest Ohio. And then the stars are birds that we're picking up post-migration or post-nesting, so think of fall migration. So you can see, a ton of hits, not a ton of hits, but a bunch of hits with Virginia rails actually coming back down the Atlantic coast. So birds that we captured at Winous in April or May or June, and then the following fall, they're actually going down the Atlantic coast. And this is, you get virtually no data from band recoveries on rails. So this is some of the first data really showing migratory routes of individual Virginia rails. So really cool stuff. And then a few hits going more down the Mississippi flyway for those of you that are familiar with the flyway system for ducks. So I'm going to totally switch gears and talk about king rails now. So Michelle Kane, she was at Central Michigan University. And it kind of segues nicely because she answered a very similar question, but with king rails, because we know they breed in really low densities in the upper Midwest, but we had no handle on migration chronology, migration corridors, and where these birds were actually wintering that do come up here and breed. So that was one big aspect of her project. And then she also developed what are called some occupancy models. So basically habitat models that would allow you to predict whether you think a king rail would be in that area or not. So that was the big focus for her. So the tricky part, kind of the opposite from the Virginia sora rail project, the tricky part for Michelle was just getting your hands on a king rail. So these guys are super rare. I talked about how rarely we pick them up on our surveys, but we do find that they're out there in the wetlands. And we started putting trail cameras out with our sound systems to get a feel for how many birds are actually out there. And we thought we had enough where we could put a handful of these transmitters on and try and answer these questions. So this transmitter is about 9.5 grams. So quite a bit bigger, too big for a Virginia rail or a sora to carry around, but plenty small enough for a king rail to carry around. That's what this picture is here. You can see how that transmitter kind of sits right on the hips of the bird. And then Michelle actually took, it's really interesting, she took our trail camera idea and she actually combined trail camera data and survey data to develop these occupancy models, which was kind of a new approach to that. So this is an awesome slide that Michelle put together. This shows the migratory routes of king rails that we captured at Winous Point over the course of, I think it was 3 years. So the technology is really new. We had some transmitter failure, so we actually marked 9 birds, and we only got good data on 4 of those individuals. But this is some of the first data ever for king rails breeding in the upper Midwest and showing where and when they migrated south in the fall. And we actually have one data on a bird coming back. So for those of you that are familiar with rails, you think of them as pretty poor flyers. We had 3 birds that left, so the red, the blue, and the purple. Those birds left Winous Point in late September, early October, and within 3 days, they were on the Gulf Coast of Louisiana. So the lines are a little deceiving because it doesn't necessarily mean they didn't stop. It just means we didn't get a transmitter data point while they were stopped. But either way, when they left. They were gone, and they made it to Louisiana in a hurry. And then they spent all winter down on the Gulf Coast, and then we had the bird in blue did kind of what you'd expect, right? It came back up into the Midwest, although it didn't come back to Winous, and eventually settled in northern Illinois and probably bred in northern Illinois that year. The bird in green is really interesting. That bird left Winous Point in the middle of the summer, so maybe a non-breeder or a failed breeder. It actually spent some time near the wilds in southeast Ohio, and in looking at the data points on Google Earth, it looked like it was using like reclaimed strip mine ponds and the vegetation around those ponds. And then later in the summer, it went to Pennsylvania, and then what you would call fall migration, it went down to South Carolina, spent the winter in coastal South Carolina, and then the following spring, it goes to the Gulf Coast rather than coming back up into the Midwest. So that has some, we tend to think of this resident population and then this migratory population as being separate for king rails, right? These resident birds on the Gulf Coast, and then these migratory birds that move back and forth. But this bird in 1 year would have been a migratory king rail, and then in the next year, you would have treated it as a resident. So that has really interesting implications, from a management standpoint, because maybe things that are going on clear down on the Gulf Coast, 500 miles away, have a ton of influence on how many king rails actually move up into the Midwest, right? So, and it just becomes way more complex and nuanced in terms of trying to manage for a bird if conditions 500 some miles away are driving how many king rails decide to move up into the Midwest each year. So there's just a lot of information, still out there that we don't understand. How often does that situation happen? Because we only have data on 4 birds. So her occupancy modeling, there's a couple really cool trail camera photo shots she has of king rails. So she developed these models, and then just a real quick explanation of what she found. So positive predictors, so things that made it more likely for a king rail to be in that specific spot. One of them was interspersion. So not solid vegetation, but little pockets of openings within your cover. And then also a little bit deeper water depths. So the caveat there is we didn't look for rails in areas with really deep water and stuff that's not rail habitat. So it was just within a range that she selected that king rails tended to be on the deeper end. And the really interesting thing here is they're actually negatively related with the presence of other rail species. So what that might suggest is, kind of niche partitioning, right? King rails are using a little bit different habitat than what the Virginia rails and soras are. But she just kind of scratched the surface on that. So Dustin, I don't have a ton to say about Dustin, which is no knock on Dustin. It's just that he's in the middle of his project right now. So he's kind of taking the next step with Michelle Kane's stuff. So he's also working with king rails. I think I mentioned we actually captured one of the king rails for his project at Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge last year. It was kind of towards the west end of the main property, maybe MS6. I'm drawing a blank on the specific unit, but towards the west end of the refuge. And really what he's trying to do, his first objective is very, very similar to what Nicole did for Virginia rails and soras. So trying to understand microhabitat selection for king rails. And we're hoping, you know, in theory, king rails are probably a little bit more of a habitat specialist. They seem more limited than Virginia rails and sora. So we're hoping we can pick up on what are these habitat characteristics. And we've had discussions with Dustin, you know, about what we've learned from Nicole's work and kind of the lack of ability to detect any of these differences and maybe things we need to do a little bit differently. And then his second objective is really similar to the correction factor surveys that I talked about. So the folks who kind of coordinate the monitoring effort were really interested in this correction factor that we developed to estimate how many birds are you actually detecting right at your survey point. What is the callback rate for king rails? Now, this is much harder to do for kings because we only mark a handful of birds. So we're not going to have 200 some data points to work with like we did for the Virginias and soras. That's the goal for Dustin's project. You know, last year, really reduced field season, obviously with COVID, but we were able to mark 5 birds last year, and we included a bird from 2019 in that data set as well. And then we'll be back out super soon here, probably the first week of May. That's typically when we start catching king rails. And Dustin is actually going to be trapping in the coastal marshes of Southeast Michigan. And then myself and our technician here at Winous, we'll probably be up at the refuge trying to catch birds, and then kind of throughout Northwest Ohio between Port Clinton and Toledo. And hopefully we can mark maybe 10 birds in a year. I'd be super happy with that. That would be a great data set to work with for a species that we really don't know anything about here in Ohio. So just to go back over the quick highlights, if I lost anybody and anybody went to sleep, this is one slide to pay attention to, just kind of summarize everything, the big take-home messages from the presentation. So we have some of the first ever documented migratory routes and wintering locations for king rails. So just really cool, really new data. And same is true to a little bit lesser extent for the Virginia rails with the Modus Tower stuff and the nanotag hits. What we assumed were largely breeding Virginia rail and sora that we would detect on our Marshburg surveys, turns out they're not. And we have to try and understand what is going on there. You know, are they still migrants? That's kind of what the Modus Tower suggests. Is there a bunch of failed breeders, or is there a large population that just doesn't breed from one year to the next? But we really don't, we don't have breeding rails like we thought we did going into this project. Really, a really good thing to understand. As far as the Marshburg surveys, we've learned population closure is really unrealistic, and we're violating this key assumption of distance sampling, right? And that doesn't invalidate the Marshburg survey. We just have some really nice recommendations out of that work for how to improve it. You know, if we're actually going to take raw data and generate abundance estimates, this is how we can go about doing it. And, you know, we've learned right off the bat, we can't call these breeding Marshburg abundance estimates. You know, the one way to get around this is to call these use days, which is, it's kind of a complicated term, but it's really very simple. And that gets you around the issue of population closure. So instead of estimating how many birds are out there, we estimate how many birds are there and for how long do they stay. Because then it doesn't matter if it's 10 Virginia rails that stay for one day or the same Virginia rail that you pick up 10 times, you have 10 rail use days, which is still really helpful from a conservation planning standpoint. If you say, okay, I want to build a marsh that supports 1,000 Virginia rail and sora use days, we can measure that. We can't actually measure how many birds are there, but we can count how many are there and how long they stay without getting at a true estimate of abundance. So a really valuable way to look at use within the wetlands as opposed to really trying to pinpoint exactly how many birds are there. What do we still need to understand? And I would make the argument for rails, it's a ton of information that we still don't understand that make managing for these guys really problematic. So for starters, where are all the Virginia rail and sora that we detect actually breeding? Are they going to the prairies? Are they going to the upper Great Lakes? Are they going into Northern Ontario and Quebec? Understanding the linkages between breeding locations and migratory locations is really important to trying to provide better habitat for these birds. Our current studies for habitat we can't find anything that they're specifically keying in on. And I already talked about this a little bit, but what are the reasons for that, right? All we can say right now is they like wetlands and they like emergent vegetation. Well, from a manager standpoint, from a habitat management standpoint, that's not super helpful. We can't do much with that in terms of trying to improve habitat. So why is that actually the case? Is there very little selection, or are we just not good at measuring the variables that we need to measure at this point in time? That's kind of the next step to me in the habitat question. And then I just hit on this, but how much exchange for king rails, how much exchange is there between this Gulf Coast population and then these migratory birds that move up into the Midwest? You know, is it really common for them to switch strategies, or did we document something that was kind of odd there? Because once again, big implications from a management standpoint. And then just tons of basic life history and phenology. You know, we don't, we just had this conversation this morning because we're starting to trap king rails again. We don't know, do they show up paired already when they get here? Or is that what they do in the big coastal wetlands, is they look for a mate and then they pair up and then they leave and go to a breeding location? We just don't, these are questions we know the answers to for a lot of other bird species that are just lacking for rails because they're so hard to study and hard to get your hands on. So with that, I always, when I talk about rails, I like to kind of end with this slide, and it's usually oriented towards a little bit more of a management audience, because when you think of wetland management, it's usually very centered on waterfowl for obvious reasons, right? Folks hunt ducks. There's a lot of human interest in ducks and wetlands and the relationships there, right? And that's kind of the context for how we manage wetlands. It's very specific to ducks. So I like to hopefully make people think about this question of why do we care about these guys? I mean, they're people like the folks in this room. I think everybody's really interested in rails and they're just really cool birds, but how do we get other folks who maybe aren't as interested but are involved in wetlands to care about these guys? And I don't need to read the quote, but I think it's just a great quote. I stole it from Aldo Leopold. But it's a little bit of ignorance on our part as managers to assume that, well, this bird, it doesn't really matter. It's not what we're interested in. So why do we care about it? And if it disappears, what does it matter, right? And I think of a car mechanic, if you're tearing an engine apart, you don't start throwing nuts and bolts out and assume you're going to be able to put that engine back and it's going to work like it should, right? So just because maybe we don't understand the role perfectly that these birds play on the landscape, we don't want to be throwing pieces and parts of these wetlands out. Like these rails, the presence of these rails to me indicate you have a functioning, healthy ecosystem, at least as healthy and functioning as we can have in our wetlands, as disturbed as they are anymore. But it's just something to think about for folks. So acknowledgements, I don't want to ignore anybody. So Winous Point, we're a really small organization. There's only 3 of us, full-time permanent. We could never do any of this on our own. Our role is kind of facilitation of this research. So we really got started in rail trapping through Sandusky County Parks and Tom Cashmere and also Mark Shieldcastle. They had refined the rail trapping techniques that we took and applied to these graduate student projects. Obviously, Ohio State University, Central Michigan should be listed on this slide as well. Our funding sources include the Fish and Wildlife Service. The Ohio Division of Wildlife funded a lot of this work, and also the Upper Mississippi River and Great Lakes Region Joint Venture. The electronics, I need to shout out to, so our executive director, many of you may know him, John Simpson. He's also our local electronics guru. So he built all of the sound systems that we use in order to catch these birds. And whenever they break, he's who we take the boxes to fix. So with that, I apologize if I forgot anybody. We've got tons of folks that have helped make this project a success. But with that, I can take any questions from the chat box, or folks can raise their hand if they want to do it that way. It doesn't matter to me.
Oh, thank you so much, Brendan. What a great program. I do see some questions coming through in the chat box. So if you want, I will go ahead and...
yeah, if you want to read them, because I'm not sure what the deal is on my screen. I can't see the chat box.
Sure, that's perfect. The first one is, I live in Ohio, but I'm spending a few months on the Gulf Coast in northern in the Gulf Coast in northern adjacent to St. Mark's National Wildlife Refuge. I hear rails every evening in the salt marshes. Do you think that these birds migrate to the Great Lakes where there is fresh water? Are they adaptable?
So on the Gulf Coast, in the saltwater marshes, there's also clapper rails, which are very, very similar to the kings. And kind of the difference is there's a little bit of overlap where they both use brackish water, but the clappers are a little bit more saltwater and the king rails use more freshwater. So the clappers you wouldn't find up here, but there's certainly a chance some of those king rails come up into the Midwest. I don't think it's very many. I've never been down there. Well, I shouldn't say I've never been down there. I haven't spent a lot of time in the coastal marshes down there. So I get the impression there are rails everywhere. So I think it's a very small percentage of that king rail population that actually moves up to breed in the Midwest. But there's certainly a chance, that one of those king rails that runs around in Louisiana in January shows up at Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge the following May.
Great, thank you so much. That's the only question that I see in the chat. I don't know if anybody wants to come off mute if they have a question, if that would be a little bit easier, but of course we still have a few more minutes for questions.
Looks like there's one question from Liz.
Yeah, I have a question. Part of it, I think it was one of the early slides, you showed some data sets from May. You had like week segments starting in May. I believe I saw a Virginia rail over near 1812 restaurant in Port Clinton area just last week. And I was wondering why wait till May? Like maybe you're losing data. Is that right? Those are dates? Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly right. So the reason those dates were picked is just because that's when the monitoring effort, that's when we do the surveys, which that's been set kind of above, like at the state and federal level, where they developed when to do the surveys. So that's why that data is shown. And they did trap a little bit prior to that because we know there's birds that are here before and then birds that continue a few birds that stick around for the summer. So yeah, that's the reason for why those graphs are just showing from May 7th to June 19th. But yeah, I mean, I've heard Virginia rails here after Thanksgiving, which is super late in the fall, and then as early as like late March.
Right.
Excuse me, when they start to arrive. So there's certainly
So when would they be nesting? I'm wondering, would they call back if they were nesting? Wouldn't they want to lay low and not draw attention?
Right. So that's a really good question. And that's why we got into the correction factor surveys, because one of the theories, so we have this trend in the data where we get very few detections later during the third survey window. And one of the theories was, well, the birds are still here. They're not calling because they're on a nest, which makes sense, right? You call if you're sitting on a nest. So that was one of the things we looked at. We did these surveys through the entire summer, and we found that the vocalizations rates weren't changing. So even if they were on a nest, they would still call back to us. And what that was telling us is, no, this drop in detections is actually just less birds, not this change in behavior. Because yeah, it would make a ton of sense for them to call less once they shift into nesting. But that doesn't seem to be the case based on what we found.
Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. Still, I don't see any additional questions in the chat box. Again, if somebody would like to come off mute and we'd love to have your question.
I have a question about the king rails that nested last year at Howard Marsh. Would we expect those again this year, or it kind of sounds like we might not expect them?
Did you hear that, Chris? I couldn't hear
I
it.
did.
Okay.
I was listening really close. So the question is from Edward, and his question is, and correct me if I'm wrong, the king rails, I believe, that were seen in Howard Marsh last year, would we expect to see those again or not so much?
So I don't have a good answer. I think there's a chance. We don't understand enough about them. One thing I will say about king rails, so we at Winous, we had a wetland purchase kind of similar to Howard Marsh, not as big, maybe 200 or 300 acres. But when we newly restored it, we had a ton of cattail. because it was a cornfield and a soybean field, and as soon as we turned it back into a wetland, that was our hot spot for catching king rails. Like the king rails really responded to that new restoration, similar to Howard Marsh is only 2 or 3 years old at this point. So I think there's something to that, at least to the vegetation structure and to what they really like as far as a new wetland restoration. Hopefully they stick around, but it seems like the king rails have kind of moved on from Metzger's. We still have a few over there, or a pair potentially, but it's not quite the hot spot it was when it was a new wetland. So I'll be interested to see, what happens if they continue to stick around at Howard Marsh or not.
Thank you. Additional questions? I have one, Brendan. Do they often change their marsh because it gets older? Because that's kind of what that last answer felt like to me. That they liked the one because it was newer and it was more of a hot spot.
Right. So there's some other studies that suggest they're pretty adaptable to changing water conditions and like new marshes versus old marshes, which makes sense that they would be, just because of where they kind of seem to inhabit this fringe of where the wetland transitions to a little bit more upland. So they need to be able to deal with, a big influx of water, or if conditions kind of dry out over the summer. And that's one thing I didn't mention from Nicole's stuff, but I remember them finding that regardless of whether the conditions changed within a unit or not, the birds really kind of stuck to it, at least within a given year. So I think they're certainly, they're probably pretty adaptable and able to deal with a range of conditions ranging from dry to wet, as long as they're within a wetland. I don't think we know enough to have a good handle on this. I mean, what I said as far as new versus old, like that's really anecdotal.
Okay, I just wondered if there was like something behind it, and that's, I guess.
Right. No, I mean, it would take, what we really need would be long-term studies that track a wetland that goes from being newly restored to what does it look like 5 years and 10 years and 20 years down the road, and then looking at the rail response to that. So I think it would take a long time to answer that question, but a really good question.
And then we have another question in the chat. It says, is there something that wetland managers at Howard Marsh can do to keep the king rails coming there? I think everybody wants them to go back.
Right. I mean, right now, if you've got wetland conditions and you have good emergent vegetation, like we don't even have, there's a lot of concern about Phragmites and invasive species, but as long as you keep those patches relatively small, the king rails will use that stuff as long as they have cover to hide in that's relatively close to water and kind of these, we talked about interspersion with Michelle Keynes. I kind of think of it as like tidal pools. They're not tidal pools, but the little pockets and openings that you get in the marsh within the emergent vegetation. If you can maintain those pockets and maintain good emergent vegetation, I think there's a good chance you can continue to have king rails. But, that's part of my job here is we have about 3,000 acres at Winous Point that we manage. And sometimes it's easy to do that and sometimes it's not. So it's not necessarily a simple thing to restore a wetland and then maintain it exactly how you want it to look. They're really dynamic systems. They're always changing.
Great, thank you. I don't see any more questions in the chat, but I was going to go ahead and do some thank yous, and I have dropped in the chat our full program schedule. So again, thank you, Brendan, for such a great program. If you take a look at the chat, you've got a lot of really amazing comments that you'll want to take a look at. As far as everyone else, I just really want to thank you for joining us. And again, I want to let you know that our full program schedule, I went ahead and dropped it in the chat, but it also can be found at www.friendsofottawan.org/Seek Refuge Days. And we'd love to have you join us for other programs. And then the last little bit of business we'd love to do is we'd love to offer you a discount coupon for filling out a survey on this program and how you felt this series went. We'd love to hear your feedback, because that's what helps us build bigger and better programs. So in 1 second, I will drop that into the chat. If you fill the survey out, you will get a coupon for our or actually I should say coupon code that you can use at our Rookery Nature Store online. So again, thank you everyone, and thank you so much, Brendan. Any final words for you, Brendan, before we go ahead and close out for the day?
No, that's it. Thanks everybody for tuning in. I hope they learned a couple things, and they're awesome birds to work with, and it's fun. I appreciate doing this sort of thing.
Great, thank you. We really appreciated having you. And everyone else, I hope you all have a great day.